I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the fierce battle for Pokrovsk rages on, with Russian troops now inside the city and 15 armoured vehicles destroyed in its outskirts, we report on the dramatic destruction of a dam inside Russia that has cut off Moscow's forces inside Ukraine. Later, we speak to one of the leading architects behind the Western initiative to seize the $300 billion in frozen Russian state assets, exploring how close this unprecedented move is to becoming reality and what it could mean for the future of the war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 28th of October, 3 years and 248 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by executive editor for audio, Dearnley, and former journalist and political entrepreneur, Hugo Dixon. But first, Francis turns to the latest from the battlefield.
Thanks, Adélie. Yesterday, I reported on a Ukrainian strike against a small dam near Belgorod, Russia, though at the time, details were scarce. Now, the picture is far clearer. That attack appears to have been a success. The dam was damaged, causing a flood that's cut off Russian units which had crossed the river near the partially occupied Ukrainian town of Vovchansk in Kharkiv Oblast. In the Shebekino area, Russian fortifications and equipment were submerged, and there are now videos of Russian soldiers lamenting how they'll have to swim to reach their old positions. Suffice to say, resupplying those trapped units will be immensely difficult for Moscow, especially as the temperature continues to fall. That's why Ukrainian forces there are saying that they expect to replenish their prisoner of war pool, their words, though there's no evidence of anyone having been captured yet. On the subject of resupply, I want to take you to around 250 kilometres southeast of Vovchansk to Konstantinivka, one of those cities in the fortress belt of Donetsk. Firmin Tarano has written a fascinating piece for The Telegraph on the innovative ways Ukrainians are trying to resupply their forces there, including using a supply robot they call the Cockroach. Now, this piece is full of maps and footage of the device in action. The soldiers who pilot it describe this device as a big box on wheels that can carry up to 200 kilograms of supplies at 20 kilometers per hour. But its progress is agonizingly slow. To reach the Ukrainian units hidden in a forest, it has to take regular stops to find cover from enemy drones. Then there's the attrition rate. Some weeks we don't lose a single robot, says one of the operating officers from a basement miles away, and some days we lose 2. Now, I highlight this story because it speaks to several themes of the moment when it comes to the battlefield, namely how units are more regularly being cut off, the innovative ways both sides are seeking to resupply their forces, and the Russian strategy of coating entire sectors of the front with cheap drones. Just listen to this Ukrainian officer quoted in the piece. If Moscow pushes in this direction, they will struggle in the urban areas and suffer thousands of casualties. That's why they are hitting our logistics. Russia wants to make the first drone siege in history. Now remember that phrase, drone siege. It may soon become common parlance. The piece also underscores something else, how the shoot and scoot tactic favoured by NATO countries no longer applies in Ukraine. In 2022, guns and tanks moved and fired in daylight. Today, most operate from fixed, camouflaged positions layered with armour. We'll include that piece in the show notes, along with an insightful one by Oliver Carroll in The Economist on how the Ukrainian military continues to challenge Western understanding of drones. The trend he describes has been happening since the very beginning of the war, but it's striking how it's still the case, namely how drone designs by Western companies have fallen flat when tested in Ukraine. As he writes, Ukrainian companies that once looked to emulate Western tech heroes like Adélie and Helsing now find themselves plotting a path for those multi-billion euro companies to follow. He quotes the man reportedly behind the drones linked to Operation Spiderweb, that raid that destroyed strategic bombers deep inside Russia, as saying no more than 20 to 30% of battleground technology is Western. Ukraine now outpaces almost every country in the world, he says. A clash of doctrines is at the heart of the issue. Until recently, Western countries concentrated on exquisite wares that worked well in limited battles against lesser opponents. The Ukraine battlefield is different, total, balanced and highly democratized. The cheap FPV drones that were pioneered by Ukraine in 2023, then copied by Russia, now destroy high-value targets in a way that previously required the most cutting-edge weapons. Russia's main innovation has meanwhile been to adopt a spam strategy, massing drones to overwhelm defences. All this makes disposability crucial. The average ground drone in Ukraine has a life expectancy of just 1 week. And when you multiply such losses along 2,000 kilometres of front line, the scale of the challenge is clear. It makes no sense to send a few Western ground systems costing hundreds of thousands of dollars into battle when Ukrainian near equivalents can be manufactured for $10,000 to $20,000. Yet that is where Western companies and their governments have often placed their bets. To quote a soldier, it's like choosing between BMWs and Skoda Octavias. A BMW is faster and more comfortable, but it really doesn't help you if your task is to give everyone cars. So a very interesting piece, which, as I say, we will link to. But let's turn now to the dire situation in Pokrovsk, Donetsk, where things remain extremely serious for Ukrainian forces there. Their commanders now openly acknowledge a sustained Russian presence inside the city. There are some reports of Ukraine regaining more territory north and splitting Moscow's troops just west of Shahove as a result of a large Russian attack there, which was repelled yesterday. Footage shows Russia using 29 units of armoured vehicles during a 6-hour battle, which saw 15 destroyed. Other small movements on the front lines have been recorded southeast of Kupiansk, with Ukrainian forces making some gains there, though Russian mill bloggers claim progress to the northeast of that settlement. Down in Zaporizhia, Ukrainian forces raised a flag in Yarulivka, with Russian forces doing the same in Pavilny. Though, as always, just because a flag is spotted does not mean these places are firmly in an army's hands. Just before I wrap up with the air war, I wanted to flag a new independent report by the UN's Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which came out yesterday. It finds that Russian military actions amount to 2 crimes against humanity. Firstly, of murder and a forcible transfer of population. And secondly, deportations and transfers of civilians from areas occupied by Russian forces, some of whom were tortured. They also find Moscow had carried out drone attacks against civilians in a wider area than previously reported, spanning over 300 kilometres on the right bank of the Dnipro River, through Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson and Mykolaiv oblasts, and goes on to describe how drones set houses on fire through sequenced attacks and the use of flammable substances, and then hinder the intervention of first responders deliberately. In addition, the report describes a pattern of deportations and transfers of civilians from Zaporizhia Oblast and includes details of the perpetrators. So we'll link to that long report as well. Last night was a calm one for most of the population of Ukraine, having a rare undisturbed night's sleep. Just 38 drones were launched by Russia overnight and quite a few after dawn. Kherson was shelled by artillery and some damage by drones was recorded in Chernihiv. Russia also says 19 drones were fired by Ukraine overnight in their direction, though, as ever, they claim there was no damage. So that's where we are in the military realm, Adélie.
Thanks, Francis. And now on to diplomatic updates, where we'll be focusing on oil today and the consequences of Donald Trump's sanctions against Russian oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft. This morning, Lukoil announced plans to sell its international assets and that consideration of a bid from potential purchasers had been started. It blames restrictive measures against the company. It is so far the most notable action taken by the company in the wake of the sanctions. Its biggest foreign asset is one of the world's largest oil fields, that's in Iraq, West Kurna 2, in which it holds a 75% stake. The company also owns several refineries, one in Bulgaria, another one in Romania. It has stakes in various oil terminals and also has upstream and downstream projects in Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, and in Africa and Latin America. On the stock market, Lukoil is now down 20% and Rosneft 13% over the rolling 5-day period since the announcement of sanctions. Another shift is being felt on oil tankers. The Moscow Times reports that Greek shipping companies are pulling back. These tankers have long been key players, carrying nearly 1/3 of Russia's seaborne oil exports this year. The withdrawal of Greek vessels has left much of the export burden to Russia's shadow fleet. That now handles most crude shipments from the Urals. Freight rates from Russia's Baltic ports to India, for example, have risen to over $8 million per cargo, with some tankers demanding now as much as $10 million. Turning to Europe, Lukoil also supplies to Hungary and Slovakia, who are the last two EU countries still buying Russian oil via the Druzhba pipeline. That's the pipeline that's often targeted by Ukrainian strikes, as we often report on this podcast, and that has been an ongoing point of tensions with Ukraine. These sanctions will take effect at the end of November, but Hungary is already looking for ways to circumvent the restrictions and maintain supplies. US Ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, said in an interview with Fox News yesterday that Hungary, unlike many of its neighbours, has not made any plans or any active steps toward weaning itself off Russian energy. He added that Washington will continue working with Budapest in order to find alternative routes for energy imports, such as through Croatia. The issue has become a rare point of friction in the otherwise warm relationship between Orbán and Trump. They're expected to meet in Washington in the second half of next week to discuss the sanctions. No doubt that Orbán is also keen to try and get that summit between Trump and Putin back on track to boost his re-election prospects. And then there is Turkey. Turkey is the third largest importer of Russian fossil fuels globally as of this summer. Its Star, S-T-A-R refinery, which is owned by Azerbaijan's SOCAR, depends heavily on Russian crude. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was in Ankara yesterday for a meeting with Erdogan, but it's unclear whether he brought up Turkey's Russian oil imports. As Politico reports, the press release from Number 10 makes no mention of it at all, and, I quote, Number 10 aides would not be drawn. The case for this, Politico continues, is that selling Erdogan a bunch of British fighter jets keeps him on our side and helps draw Turkey further from Russia's financial reach. Our friends aren't perfect, but we love them anyway.
Are you listening to that, Dom Nichols?
Talking to Bloomberg, Starmer said that he had urged the US president to pressure China to stop buying Russian oil in a phone call with the American president on Sunday. Starmer said that these sanctions have put the fight for Ukraine in a better place and that the prospects for Ukraine are improving, which makes Kyiv's allies cautiously optimistic. Meanwhile, in Russia, the country continues to face a fuel crisis as a result of Ukraine's ongoing drone attacks on Russian oil refineries and infrastructure. But these strikes have apparently nothing to do with the shortages. That is according to Energy Minister Sergei Tsivilyov. Instead, he said, fuel costs have risen for two main reasons. One, scheduled maintenance at oil refineries, which have reduced output. And two, the traditional summer spike in demand. He added that reports of unplanned stoppages at several refineries led to panic buying and pushed the prices even higher. Still, according to the minister, that is all unrelated to the repeated drone attacks and the fact that last week, the Kremlin announced it was drafting reservists to help protect its critical energy facilities. And finally, a last update from me, Francis, pivoting to nuclear weapons and following up on yesterday's news on the Burevestnik cruise missiles. Putin has formally withdrawn from the plutonium management and disposition agreement with the US. The agreement obligated both countries to dispose of 34 tons of weapons-grade plutonium, that is enough for thousands of nuclear warheads, that are no longer required for defense purposes. Under the deal, the plutonium was to be turned into fuel for civilian nuclear power plants. Now, Russia had ratified the agreement in 2011, and the implementation was meant to begin in 2018. But Moscow suspended its participation in 2016, accusing Washington of violating its obligations. At the time, Putin justified the suspension by citing the emergence of a threat to strategic stability as a result of unfriendly actions by the US, and he had demanded the lifting of sanctions imposed after the 2014 occupation and annexation of Crimea. The Russian parliament passed the denunciation bill in early October, paving the way for Putin's formal withdrawal, which happened yesterday. That decision effectively ends one of the last remaining post-Cold War nuclear security agreements between Moscow and Washington.
And that was one of the subjects that I talked about with the historian Serhiy Plokhy yesterday. So if you missed that episode, highly, highly recommend it. It was a really interesting one.
As the EU was going back to the drawing boards on how to use the Russian frozen assets last week, I spoke with former journalist and political entrepreneur Hugo Dixon. He was one of the architects behind the idea of turning Russia's $300 billion into a reparations loan to Ukraine. For the last 2 years, he's been working on how to make this idea possible and pitched it to leaders around the world. Here is our conversation. This week, there has been major movement to unlock the 300 billion Russian frozen assets in Europe. But this morning, we've woken up to the surprising news that the deal on the reparations loan had failed to go through overnight. Now, just a few months ago, we were only talking about using the interests of these assets. So, despite the setback, we're in a new phase where the Europeans are coming closer and closer to channeling those funds to Ukraine. Can you take us through that process and how we got here?
So I think it's important to say that although there is progress on this issue, it is far from being a done deal. Belgium, where most of the assets are sitting, said no to the precise proposal that the European Commission had put on the table. But the other countries were favourable to the idea, and they said go back to the European Commission, look at some other options, and come back to us in December. The second thing I think is important to say is that we're not talking about seizing the assets or confiscating the assets. The idea that's on the table is a reparations loan. And what's meant by that is it's a loan to Ukraine that Ukraine would only have to repay if Russia paid it war reparations. That's why we call it a reparations loan. It's a very different idea from seizing the assets. And to answer your question of how I'm involved in this idea, is that almost 2 years ago, it seemed to me clear that there was not going to be the political will to confiscate the assets. But Russia owed Ukraine war damages, vastly in excess of the amount of assets that are frozen. The problem was that it was going to take many years before the tribunal that is being set up to adjudicate on these war reparations finishes its job. And so what you needed to do is you needed to bridge the gap between now, when Ukraine needs the money, to some point many years in the future when the tribunal will have done its job. And so we came up with the idea of a reparations loan. And that's on a different legal basis from seizing the assets. There are people who argue that it is perfectly legal to seize the assets. The problem is that in continental Europe, there isn't appetite to seize the assets. But there is quite a lot of interest in this reparations loan idea. And so what happened was, I think that in terms of the milestones, the first important thing was Trump's election, because it then became clear that America wasn't going to provide any more money to Ukraine. It might provide arms, but Europe would have to find the money to pay for those arms. So that was quite a shock to the system for the Europeans, particularly in the EU. Second key thing was Friedrich Merz's election as Chancellor of Germany, whereas his predecessor had been very much against doing anything ambitious with these Russian assets. Friedrich Merz was much more open to it, and a few weeks ago he came out extremely forcefully in favor of a reparations loan. And just before that, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, in her State of the Union address, said that it wanted there to be a reparations loan. And I think that what's driving this is really that Europe has three choices, really. One is to find much more money from their own national budgets, which is extremely difficult because it's not just the UK that's got fiscal problems. Most of continental Europe has got fiscal problems. So that's option one, not very attractive. Option two is to allow Ukraine to lose the war because it doesn't have enough money. That's extremely unattractive because that undermines European security big time. And option three is somehow to use the Russian assets, but not to seize them, and come up with an alternative financial mechanism to channel the money without actually confiscating it. And so that's the idea of the reparations loan.
So this reparations loan, it's quite a complex financial and legal mechanism. Can we take it apart together? How does it work exactly?
There is one thing that is in common to all versions of the reparations loan. That is, Ukraine gets a lot of money, which it only has to repay if it gets reparations. Okay, so now to come to the European Commission's version of this plan, the next thing it's important to understand is that the biggest chunk of Russian assets is at the Belgian depository called Euroclear. So there are about 185 billion euros there. That's about 2/3 of the total of Russian assets that have been frozen. And so the European Commission's plan has focused mainly on Euroclear. And what happened was at the time of the war, the Russian assets were in the form of government bonds issued by Western governments. But they were short-term bonds, and now 3.5 years on, most of those bonds have turned into cash. And those assets have been frozen since the start of the war. So that means that Russia can't get hold of them. Now, because the assets have turned into cash, technically, the cash does not belong to Russia. Technically, it belongs to Euroclear, and Euroclear has a parallel obligation to repay Russia the money that it has deposited with Euroclear. But of course, because the assets are frozen, Russia can't actually force Euroclear to give it its money back. So what has happened up till now is that Euroclear has popped this cash, which is technically its cash, at the European Central Bank. So that's the current status. The European Commission plan is that instead of that cash being at the European Central Bank, it should be lent to the European Union. And the European Union will then lend it on to Ukraine in this reparations loan, which Ukraine only has to repay if Russia pays war reparations. So technically, the European Union will owe a lot of cash to Euroclear. And Russia will never pay reparations, in my opinion, and therefore Ukraine will never repay the European Union. But so long as the Russian assets stay frozen, the European Union doesn't actually have to repay Euroclear. So that's the way that the mechanism is supposed to work.
What have been some of the biggest challenges in getting to this point? And why were some European countries very skittish at the idea of going through with this?
Well, I think that there was a lot of concern among European Union countries, particularly Germany and France and Belgium, about seizing the assets, because some lawyers say that's legal and some lawyers say it's not legal. And so they were a bit worried about doing something that might be illegal. And I think now that they've understood the idea of a reparations loan, which is not confiscation, that has got the Germans and the French comfortable with the idea. Another important figure is Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank. She was dead set against confiscation, but she has come round to the idea of the reparations loan. There is, though, still the problem of Belgium. And although the mechanism that the European Commission has set out is very ingenious. If you're sitting in Belgium, you're worried. Okay, it sounds like a good scheme, but what happens if there's a flaw in it? What happens if Russia is able to challenge this on a legal basis and say that even though the European Commission says that there's no confiscation involved, this loan is just confiscation by another name? The Russians are going to come after us in Belgium, and this is a lot of money compared to the size of our economy. Therefore, we're not going to do this unless the rest of the other European Union countries provide us with a guarantee that makes sure that if it all goes pear-shaped, you will share the cost with us. Whereas a few months ago it was the Germans, French and Belgians, now it's only Belgium that is really seriously standing in the way. Now, the European Commission, under its scheme, has proposed guarantees for Belgium, but the Belgian Prime Minister thinks that they're not sufficiently solid.
What do they need to make them more solid, then?
It's not quite clear. One of the problems is that communication between the European Commission and the Belgian government hasn't been very good. That's because Belgium is in the midst of a political crisis at the moment, and its Prime Minister has been preoccupied in the last week with trying to shore up his government, and so may not have had the bandwidth to focus on this particular issue. So that's one theory. But if we want to go into the precise things that the Belgian Prime Minister has said, is there's two things that he seems to be particularly keen to get absolutely nailed down. One is that if, for any reason, Russia is able to unfreeze its assets without paying reparations, that is the scenario when there will be a problem, because Euroclear will have to repay Russia, but the EU will not have got any money from Ukraine. And that's the scenario which the Belgians are particularly anxious about, that in that situation, the Belgians are saying, we need there to be a guarantee that the European Union is going to give us the cash in that scenario, and a guarantee that it would come immediately. So that's the first thing that the Belgians are insisting on. Now, the European Commission has said that this is what it is proposing, but in the paper that it sent round to governments, there wasn't much detail on it. And so it's quite possible that the European Commission's promises of guarantees and liquidity is code for you'll get the cash immediately, were not enough because it was just a couple of sentences in a very short paper. So if that's the case, and if that really is the problem, then it's quite likely that the European Commission will be able to reassure Belgium with much more detail of how this guarantee and this liquidity would operate before European Union leaders meet again in December. The second thing that Belgium has said is, we don't want you just focusing on Euroclear. Although Euroclear is 185 billion out of the total Russian assets inside the EU, there are another 25 billion euros. And Belgium wants the other 25 brought into the mix because it feels that will give them safety in numbers. We don't really know where those other assets are, but there's thought to be partly in Luxembourg and partly in France. And so it's almost like they want as many countries as possible to get their hands dirty in this process. But I think that should be surmountable too. Although the European Commission did focus on Euroclear, again, in the paper that they circulated, they said, we are also working on bringing the other 25 billion euros into the mix. And so I suppose if you're Belgium and you're sitting there and you want safety in numbers, you say, well, give us the detail.
Yes, you want to know exactly what's going to happen in that unlikely scenario. Could Russia do anything to fight back on the financial front and get the assets unfrozen?
Okay, those are two separate questions. In terms of fighting back, it could retaliate. It could, for example, seize the Western assets that are inside Russia. But these are not government assets, and these are mainly corporate assets, and there would be no legal basis for them to do that. Also, in my view, the West has got financial escalation dominance vis-à-vis Russia, because if Russia tries to hit back financially, it's going to get really badly hurt. These Western investors are not going to want to invest in Russia anytime in the foreseeable future. And this will still be an obligation of the Russian state. And at some point, a few years down the line, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 years, Putin will no longer be there. And if his successors ever want to do any business with the West, before they can even move, they will have to pay off the investors who they expropriate now. So I think that it's quite difficult for Russia to hit back financially. But you asked the second question, is there anything that they can do to unfreeze their assets? So there are basically two options for them. One is a legal option, to bring a legal case saying that it is illegitimate to freeze their assets, that this is interference with their right to property. They could have done that any time in the last 3.5 years, and that seems to me a pretty hopeless cause for them to push. Much more promising for them is to try to get the assets unfrozen as part of a peace deal. And here their best chance is probably to persuade Donald Trump that they're going to agree a peace deal which will be, good for Trump's ambition to win a Nobel Peace Prize, etc., but that one of the conditions for that peace deal is that their assets are unfrozen. And at that point, the Europeans will say, no, they're not going to be unfrozen until Russia pays reparations. But what happens if Donald Trump says to the Europeans, come on, I'm insisting on this, you have to unfreeze the assets, and they're not going to be reparations? I think that would be really bad if it happened, but it is probably Putin's most promising route to get the assets unfrozen.
And in terms of challenges, you've obviously mentioned Belgium, Germany and France. Now, Hungary is very close to Russia, and they've been very important in the European Union to stall the European Union taking sanctions against Russia. Have they been a challenge to overcome as well in this scenario, and could they be pushing back?
Yeah. We don't know if they're really going to be a problem, but they didn't have to be a problem yet, because Belgium is a problem. And I think that Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, didn't appear early at the European Council, and he didn't take part in these particular discussions. He could, at some future point, try to veto this reparations loan. And at that point, the European Commission believes that he doesn't have a veto. They believe that it's possible to move ahead with this under what the European Union calls qualified majority voting. That's where you don't require every country to approve it. But that's a contentious legal point, and there are others who think that Hungary would have a veto. So that remains a potential obstacle. Also, he's been very keen on the Europeans doing something ambitious with these Russian assets, not least because he knows that a lot of the money will be recycled back to America to buy American arms. So if Trump retains his current posture, I think it's quite likely that Orban will not be a problem. But then again, if Trump flips again, Orban might be a problem, and then there would be this legal dispute about whether it does or does not have a veto.
And so that money would be primarily used for Ukraine fighting the war right here and right now, so for defense purposes. Do you think it would at all be able to trickle down to actual reparations payments, either to rebuild Ukraine or for victims of war crimes and victims of the war throughout the country? And is that linked to all of the work documenting war crimes that a lot of organization and prosecution services are doing on the ground in Ukraine then? Or is that entirely separate?
Well, the Ukrainian government is saying that the money should be used not just for armaments, but for general budget purposes, for reconstruction and for some compensation of victims. The Europeans are saying it should be used primarily for armaments. So there might be some wiggle room where a little bit could be used for other things. But the main source behind this is that there's no point in doing a full reconstruction of the Ukrainian economy until you get at least a ceasefire. Otherwise, Russia's just going to go back and bomb it to smithereens again. What's more, if you lose this war because you haven't invested enough in defense, what you're going to end up with is Ukraine as a vassal state of Russia, generation after generation of misery upon misery, and you're not going to get any reparations at all. So while it would be nice to do all of these things simultaneously, the highest priority is defense.
To broaden a little bit the context of this, it's obviously not the first time that a country has an obligation to pay war reparations to another. What are some of the legal precedents that have kind of built up this case and this mechanism? And how is Russia's invasion different to what we've seen in the past?
Okay, so there are the principles of international law which were drawn up by some experts at the behest of the United Nations General Assembly. And this codifies what is understood to be international law. And one of the key principles is that if one country illegally damages another country, it must pay reparations. So what does that mean in this case? There is an illegal invasion by Russia. Hardly anybody, apart from the Kremlin stooges, deny that. Secondly, there is a huge amount of damage. The World Bank report of earlier this year put it in excess of $500 billion. Then the other thing is that 3 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly called for Russia to pay war reparations and called for an international claims commission to be established to adjudicate on this. And that is in the process of being set up. The draft treaty has been finalized. It now needs to be signed by the governments backing it, and then it needs to get on with its work. So that's the sort of more or less the legal basis. Normally, although the legal basis is clear that aggressors have to pay reparations, it hardly ever happens because aggressors often win the wars that they launch, and it's then almost impossible to force them to pay up. As far as the precedent, the nearest precedent is after Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi leader, invaded Kuwait. After that, an international claims commission was set up, and after, I think, a couple of decades, it ruled, and over $50 billion was then paid out to the victims. That was done by taking a share of Iraq's oil revenue, siphoning it off and redirecting it to the victims. What makes the Russian case different is it left a huge amount of its sovereign assets in the West when it invaded. It's something over $300 billion, as I said. The biggest chunk is in Belgium. And this makes a difference because it's not necessary for the Ukrainians to march on Moscow to collect war damages. We have the money for at least perhaps half of the damages is already frozen here in the West. Now, we won't get the rest. And if this war keeps going for a few years, the damages will keep mounting. I wouldn't be surprised if we got to $1 trillion of damages. Well, the Ukrainians are never going to get more than the amount of Russian assets that are frozen in the West. But that is something that we can use, actually, has the capacity to be a game changer, because this is a large sum of money. It could keep Ukraine fighting for another 3 or 4 years against Russia. And that means that Putin will know that he can't win the easy way.
On the Ukraine side of things, they will obviously be the recipient of a very big loan. As you've said, they're running low on cash. It's very unlikely they would have to repay it, but could it have a detrimental effect for them in terms of state budget and tip the balance sheet? Could it affect, for example, their financial ratings?
No, it wouldn't do that. It would be extremely positive for their finances. This will be what in financial circles is known as a limited recourse loan. That means it doesn't normally have to be repaid. It only gets repaid in this very strange circumstance and very unlikely scenario that Russia pays reparations. But in that case, Ukraine will have the cash to repay the loan. Therefore, if you're sitting there as an ordinary Ukrainian bondholder or as an analyst in one of these rating agencies, you won't view this as Ukrainian debt. It's effectively Russian debt.
Is there anything we haven't talked about or any final thoughts you'd like to put forward?
Well, I think that it's probably worth touching a little bit on those other countries outside the EU, including the UK, because although about 3/4 of the Russian assets are held inside the EU, there's another chunk, about $70 billion, outside the EU, including Japan is the biggest, UK is another significant share. The UK has said that it would like to make its own reparations loan. It hasn't spelt out the exact mechanism, whether it will be exactly the same financial plumbing as what the European Commission has been talking about. But it would share the same core feature that Ukraine would only have to repay the money if Russia paid it reparations. So the more that we can get this extra cash that's outside the EU into the mix, obviously the bigger the loan will be, and that will make a bigger impression on Vladimir Putin that he can't win this war of attrition. The other thing that I'd say from a UK perspective is that there is a question of which countries' arms will be bought with the reparation loan money. And the European Union is leaning towards saying that the money should be used mostly for buying Ukrainian arms or EU arms. But it seems to me that it's in the UK's interest and also Japan's interest and other countries, if they get part of this, that they are included in the supplier base. That's not just because that will be good for their own arms industries, but the wider the array of suppliers that Ukraine can turn to, the more competition there will be among different companies to provide different bits of military kit, and the better value for money that Ukraine will get. And therefore, from a British perspective, it's much better if we can somehow join up with this EU initiative and perhaps bring in the Canadians and the Australians and the Japanese as well, and get these economies of scale, because we want Ukraine to get the biggest possible bang for its buck.
And what about the US? How much frozen assets do they have? And it seems very unlikely that politically they would commit to something like this. What is the mood music there, would you say?
So America has frozen about $5 billion, so not very much. There is legal authority in America for the president actually just to seize those assets and hand them to Ukraine. The full confiscation. That was legislation that was passed even before Trump became president. I think whether the Americans go for something with the Russian assets, either a loan or pure confiscation, will very much depend on Trump's mood at the moment when the Europeans move. If he's in the same sort of mood that he is today, where he wants to put pressure on Putin, he probably will want to join the club. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of America joining this initiative, but they're certainly not going to be leading it, and they don't have the sums of money frozen in America that in themselves would make a difference. But I do think it would be a bonus if they were part of the club.
That's fascinating. And so do you think countries that you've mentioned, like Australia, Japan, would they come around to it as well?
Well, Japan is the most important, and I think it's quite difficult to know. They've just got a new prime minister. She is considered to be more hawkish than the previous one, and they have also in recent years been more open to the idea of thinking of the conflicts in Europe and Asia as all part of one giant conflict, because China and Russia are super close allies. So I think we should certainly try and get the Japanese online. Canadians have already said that they're up for this, but they're sitting on very few Russian assets. I think Australia, again, is quite small. Switzerland is significant sums, and of course they like to maintain neutrality, but they did go along with the freeze, and I think there's quite a lot of pressure that the European Union can put on Switzerland to get them to be part of the consortium. So I think there's a reasonable chance. And of course, if the Americans do come in, even if they only come in for their $5 billion, which is what they're sitting on, that will help to rope in the other countries such as Japan and Switzerland.
Hugo, thank you very much for joining us. On to final thoughts. Francis, I hear you want to change careers?
Well, yes, thanks, Adélie. Since we're crunching the numbers today, I wanted to end with a story which just underscores again that we're in the wrong line of work. So Medusa's written a piece about the extraordinary amount of money that's been produced for the Ukrainian armed forces by those using OnlyFans. That's the subscriber platform for erotic content, for those who don't know. I didn't know any of this, by the way, until I was reading about this article. So much money is being made by this, in fact, that the Ukrainian government wants to turn even more of it into profit for them. So they want to tax it to get more themselves. There's only one problem. Under Ukrainian law, producing or distributing pornography is a criminal offence, punishable by fines or even prison time. Now, OnlyFans was founded in 2016 by a British businessman, but was actually later acquired in 2018 by a Ukrainian-American entrepreneur called Leonid Radvinsky. He's now worth an estimated $7.8 billion and earned over $700 million in dividends from the platform in 2024 alone. So this is big money that we're talking here. According to Ukraine's state tax service, Ukrainian OnlyFans creators owe nearly $9 million in back taxes, though this figure covers income taxes for only the years 2020 through 2022. And it's expected that there will be a huge rise of users, for reasons I'll go on to explain in a moment, after the war. Now, Ukrainian tax authorities now have access to the data on citizens earning money through the platform and have begun efforts to collect what they say they're owed. OnlyFans has paid a 20% VAT in Ukraine, like other international digital platforms. But in 2024, Ukraine's tax service turned its attention to the creators, as I say, arguing that they too should have to pay income taxes. Now, content creators are outraged because many of them have actually been doing this for a long time, in part to raise money for the Ukrainian military. One of them is quoted on Yulia Mendel's Substack. She says, "I'm a diligent taxpayer and an OnlyFans model creating erotic content. Over 5 years, I've paid over $1 million in taxes to the state." When you read the piece, that's further to donations she's made herself to certain units on the front line, etc. 40 million, this is her again, 40 million is equivalent to 100 pickup trucks or 2,000 FPV drones for Ukraine's armed forces. 40 million translates to hundreds of Russian soldiers defeated on the front lines. So that's the user there. We'll link to both of those pieces on a really unexplored but I think interesting subject, which we've referenced I think a couple of times over the years, but these are some really deeper dives into what's been going on and indeed the attempts by the Ukrainian state to profit on something that previously it would have been denounced and shunned. So that's the story, Adélie. I should say I've long harboured a secret wish that the Telegraph will let me write a weekly agony aunt column called Only Franz, but no response to my appeal as yet. I'll keep you all posted on that one.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.